Is that it?
Do you want me to expand on that?
Yes, please.
So, the Supreme Court and its Chief Justice decided that if they were to strike down this particular so-called landmark social legislation, it would redound to the detriment of the Supreme Court's esteem. Now, normally, the court isn't concerned about whatever this notion is, as our framers contemplated, this esteem of the court. However, I only look at the ruling, understand my take on the law itself, and see that this is inconsistent with precedent, it's inconsistent with the Constitution. It addressed issues that were only raised at the last minute by the court, and which got no other members to join him with. This was a concurrence, and so it has the rule of law because we accept that a concurring opinion, even though it is the statement of one man, has this authority. This is politics pure and simple. I don't know how one can look at it otherwise.
But what I don't understand is that there clearly is a majority, and probably a large majority of the American people who don't want this mandate. So from a purely political perspective, wouldn't it have made more sense for him to rule according to the Constitution and say Obamacare is toast?
Well, part of the reasons why our framers didn't contemplate the idea of the court being political is they're not really good at it. They looked at the fact that Congress pushed this through, violating a number of rules of the Congress itself to do so, not to mention the president's pledge to operate in a transparent and open fashion. They watched this and concluded that this law needed to have deference precisely because it had been adopted by what we in the legal community refer to as the political branches. They had come together and reached this conclusion, and this Chief Justice decided that he was going to find a way not to strike down. Now, I will tell you, this ruling was extremely disingenuous. Actually, I'm going to quibble with you somewhat. He actually did not rule that the federal government had an unlimited tax power. What he essentially did was push to a later set of hearings how far and to whom do the existing tax powers that are out in this ruling apply to. I imagine that you're going to see simple majorities, unless, of course, we have more politics. You're going to see simple majorities on the court ruling that the traditional restraints on taxing authority are going to apply, and we're going to see this particular case collapse. But it isn't useful to have it collapse in the future. It was useful to have it collapse while everyone was watching.
We had a comment from Alphonse in the chat room regarding Obamacare. He said the Senate wrote the law and attached it to an obscure revenue bill written by Congress. H.R. 2525 is the bill Congress passed dealing with IRS dealings with the military. The Senate took that and wrote Obamacare, and the Senate can't write tax law. Hence, the entire thing should be unconstitutional. Can you comment on that?
Well, actually, that is a case. Liberty University has to have arguments on that very question. It is probably likely to go before the Fourth Circuit, and we will see it come back again before the Supreme Court. My answer to you is an echo of what I said earlier, and that is that even though the political way that the Chief Justice responded to the Affordable Care Act was embarrassing, would be shameful as far as our framers are concerned, it was actually the victory that the analysts suggested at the time. There are going to be numerous attacks on this legislation, and precisely based on whether or not the taxing power of Congress was properly operated. And in this case, it does appear to the casual observer that this is a bill that originated in the United States Senate. As many people may or may not be aware, there was a Senate race after Senator Kennedy died, and with Senator Brown won a special election and campaigning solely on promising the people of Massachusetts, if you vote for me, I will not vote to pass the Affordable Care Act. He was elected, and precisely because of that, we simply witnessed, I used to work on Capitol Hill, we witnessed something nearly unprecedented, and that was that the Congress was forced to take a half-written bill, pass it in the House, and send it to the President with gaps, with changes, with all manner of provisions that simply had no actual sections associated with them. So you might have 4 or 5 different provisions affecting this particular treatment, and in a similar situation have nothing, or in another section have actually the opposite, giving the Secretary of Health and Human Services broad power, lawmaking power, to decide these kinds of difficulties. This was poor lawmaking. This was a brutal assault on liberty. And when the Americans were watching, a teachable moment for them to see the value of a Supreme Court, the court, led by its Chief Justice, let them down.
By the way, WWCR Worldwide Christian Radio listeners, you should now be with us on 5.070 megahertz, and hopefully you got the word to make the changeover. Otherwise, you're listening to static right now. Do you believe, Horace, that assuming a Romney win and assuming the Senate takes, the Republicans take the Senate, do you believe Obamacare will be repealed?
I do believe that Obamacare will be repealed, but I also believe that it is very likely that the premises that Obamacare are based on are not going to be rejected. Here's a fact. You can't have a system called insurance if people are allowed to buy a policy after injury has been diagnosed or designated. If I get into a car accident and I wait until I get into the wreck to buy a policy and the insurance company is required to sell it to me, that's not insurance. It's a whole separate kind of scheme, but it's not insurance. Fundamentally, most Americans seem to think that it is appropriate to say in America, regardless of whether we have the Affordable Care Act, a principle such as you should be allowed to wait until after illness to decide whether or not you're going to buy a policy, and a company should not have the right to A, not charge you, or B, change what it charges you since you, in fact, have this pre-existing condition. There are several other of these types of mandates that all go to the point of, is it my personal responsibility to see to it, my and my family's responsibility to see to it that I am provided health care, or is it society's responsibility? We will repeal the Affordable Care Act, but we're not rejecting this notion that ultimately it's society's job to see to it that every person has health care. However you try to carry that out, it will not work.
No, and I hear what you're saying. It's something I've said for many, many years. You do not have a right to health care. You have a right to the pursuit of health care, but you do not have a right to health care, and people just don't get that. The Constitution is regarded as the supreme law of the land. It is a limitation on government powers, yet the government regularly disregards the Constitution, and the President regularly circumvents constitutional authority imbued in Congress through the use of executive orders. Considering that the Constitution is the supreme law of the land, would it be fair to say that the U.S. federal government has become a lawless or perhaps an outlaw government?
Well, the U.S. government clearly is not constrained by its existing Constitution, and to the degree that that makes it one that operates in a lawless fashion, you have to say yes. To the degree that we mean by lawless, merely something that is regularly destructive in the lives of others, well, that's a mixed question. It would depend on whose axe is being gored.
No, but I specifically meant because the Constitution is the supreme law of the land. If you don't obey the Constitution, you're presumably breaking...
Well, that's why I said I would agree with that. I would agree with that statement. Some folks say it's the equivalent of saying that the U.S. government is therefore a bank robber. It could be, it could not be, but it can still figure out how not to be constrained by its law. And it is presently unconstrained by most of its law. It is, in large circumstances, untethered to the Constitution that our framers have adopted.
I want to move over to one of your other fields of expertise, intellectual property rights. Now, the United States has been seeking to extend what I consider to be imperialistic policies throughout the world, using copyright infringement on intellectual property as its excuse. In New Zealand, the U.S. has conspired to libel and slander Kim.com, fabricating evidence and rendering untrue characterizations of this essentially old man in order to get him extradited to the U.S. Now, frankly, this stinks of Nazi Gestapo tactics of which Adolf Hitler would be proud. What are your thoughts on the Kim.com situation and, to a greater degree, this tactic being employed by the U.S. against people like Kim, Julian Assange, and the like?
Well, I'm a little bit more familiar with the Julian Assange case. I have to admit to being unfamiliar with the first case you mentioned. Here is my general take. I have seen abuses on the part of the federal government in which they use either international treaties or other federal funds or other mechanisms to achieve ends to which they were never intended. I was involved in a situation a few years back in which a British national was accused of engaging in systemic tax fraud. Now, on the merits, there was little to no case. I'm going to just give a little bit. A British national came to America, met with some friends while there, gave $5,000, left, went back home. Some 50 years later, the investment of that $5,000 had turned into about $100 million. And controlling interest on the part of this British national. However, day-to-day activity over 50 years had been done in the hands of another. When that individual who was responsible, an American citizen, died, having not paid taxes, having not filed SEC forms, and engaged, he actually committed suicide. A number of things. The American government, instead of saying, oh, well, we didn't catch this, decided to use 9/11 anti-terrorism treaties as a way to try to snatch and grab this British national to bring him to the United States so that they could put him in tax court, where instead of you having the right to remain silent and all of your traditional constitutional rights, it's an administrative process where a finding of guilt, or in this case, a finding of liability, could be used later in a federal court for the purposes of prosecution. Obviously, that person wanted to avoid that, and obviously, from my perspective, that was an example of the kind of abuses where the federal government uses powers that it has in a way never contemplated.
Well, let's talk about the Julian Assange situation. He's been accused, but not charged, with sexual misconduct. Based on nothing more than an accusation, Britain has agreed to extradite him to Sweden. Assange fears if he gets extradited to Sweden, then the U.S. will get him extradited, and that will be the end of his life. Personally, I agree. What has happened to the presumption of innocence? Since when have people been extradited based solely on an unsubstantiated accusation? How has such totalitarianism and tyranny seeped into the fabric of so many governments today?
I'm going to tell you, I share your skepticism. However, I'm no expert on extradition law, but I share your skepticism that having witnessed what I saw in the IRS context be abused with 9/11 anti-terrorism treaty rules, I would be troubled to a great degree to see that the federal government of the United States uses a pretext of this sexual assault to find Mr. Assange in a American-friendly country and then seek to grab him and take him under that pretext. That would seem to me to violate the rules. That would seem to me to flout the process. Now, I am not opining on the merits of Mr. Assange's charges vis-a-vis America. I'm simply saying I do not support being able to be extradited based on unrelated charges and then using them as a pretext to get you to America. That to me is fundamentally unfair. That to me is the very precise thing why we have laws, why we have the notion that we will have a judicial process as opposed to simply monarch reaches out and says, take him away. That's not supposed to be our system.
But even more so, I mean, since when do you get extradited for an accusation? Even the Swedish authorities said he's not being charged with anything. We just want to question him. How can people be extradited?
No, I'm agreeing with you. I'm agreeing with you. I don't agree that someone should. If Mr. Assange is accused of rape, if he's accused of murder, if he's accused of any number of things, I don't agree that that's a pretext for the American government to be able to get him in a American-friendly country and take him to America for unrelated things. If there is a process that other countries have agreed to with other countries vis-a-vis those crimes, I want them to adhere to the laws that they have adopted. I'm unfamiliar, however, with how European extradition rules work. I just don't believe you should be allowed to grab a person for American law violations, in this case espionage, under the pretext that he is brought to Sweden or Norway or any of our NATO allies countries that for crimes that they're investigating, that we should be allowed to then snatch him and bring him to America. That, to me, is fundamentally unfair.
It blows my mind, I mean, in this case. All right, predict the future for us. Okay, look into your crystal ball. What do you see happening in America over the next 5 to 10 years?
Well, we've got one of two courses that we're going to take.
And you've only got a minute and a half to answer that.
Okay, there is ample opportunity for a nationwide revival to take place, similar to what we saw at the beginning of our country and then shortly after the Civil War. Or we're going to head down the direction of more coarsening, of more societal dreck, and of more disconnectedness from the notion of individual responsibility and displacing that with collective responsibility. We're going to see more and more conflicts between the role of God in society and society. In 5 to 10 years, that revival is going to turn down one course, maybe a course that saves America. That revival doesn't happen. I'm going to be very, very troubled by what I see or what my progeny sees.
Well, I'm with you on that. My guest has been Horace Cooper, Research Fellow with the National Center for Public Policy Research and Director of Law and Regulation at the Institute for Liberty. If you'd like to learn more about Horace's work, you can go to www.horacecooper.com, horacecooper.com. And Horace, I certainly hope you will use your outreach and your clear intelligence on these matters to keep trying to just promote that rule of law concept and that idea of people helping each other. Just keep putting that out there because, frankly, I think that's what we need. We need people to start doing things differently. What we've done up to this point has gotten us where we are. If we don't like where we are, we got to do something different.
From your lips to God's ears.
Excellent. Horace Cooper, again, www.horacecooper.com. Thanks so much for spending this time with us. God bless you in the work you are doing.
Thank you for having me on your program.
It's been a pleasure.